Good morning. Welcome to the Internet Seriously, a new show, and this is the first of our podcasts from the DNS Research Federation, where we bring together internet experts to talk about various aspects of the internet. And it's just an informal podcast, and we're really essentially making it up as we go along. So hi there, my name's Lucien Taylor and I am an internet expert, and I'm joined by two guests. The first is Emily Taylor. If you introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Emily Taylor. I'm a co-founder of the DNS Research Federation, and I've got a background in law and policy.
And now we'll hand over to our remote guest, Kieren. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Kieren McCarthy, and I'm a sort of long-term tech journalist and internet governance policy person.
Good to be here at this podcast. It will be streaming live in September, but these are the first few trials of this podcast where we try and get the format right, and we basically throw ourselves into this sort of as live. Just to tell everyone, we're not over prepared for this. It's really more of a discussion and less of a presentation. Having said that, later on I'm going to be doing a presentation about a topic that I want to talk about, which is something we launched earlier in the week. So I think we'll start. Which one of you two wants to start? And we'll ask you some questions.
I want Kieren to start.
All right. And just to say, Kieren has already suggested some enhancements to this podcast, because apparently Emily and I look like we're in a nightclub while Kieren is clearly in his home. But Emily, anyway, Kieren, why don't you talk to us about introduce your topic for this week?
What's on my mind? I'll tell you what's on my mind. The general election is what's on my mind. I'm actually running in it, but that's a separate issue. We're hearing a lot.
Oh, sorry. Can we just clear that up? What that actually means? You're actually running in it, just to be clear.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm the Lib Dem candidate for Putney. I live in Putney in London, and I'm the Lib Dem candidate. So while everyone else is sort of, I imagine, seeing occasional TikToks or watching two men shout on the television screen at one another, I'm sort of in the weeds of it. Yeah. Leaflets and knocking on doors and organising meetings and that sort of thing.
What's it like knocking on doors and talking to people? Are people happy to see you, or do they engage with you? Do they want to talk to you?
Yeah, well, I don't know if you know Putney, but it's a very nice, reasonable place. So I've yet to have anybody be anything but lovely to me.
Yeah,
So that's part of the reason why I live here. You know, it's a very lovely part of London, and I have the interesting thing is you run into people who are, have these incredible jobs. So you start talking about some element of policy. You always pick up when they sort of narrow their eyes, and then you say, you seem to know a lot about this, and then you find out that they're the head of some charity that does it, or they're the head of some arm of the NHS, which I ran into the other day when I was talking about plans for the NHS. And it turns out that they've spent the last 30 years doing it. So at that point I just say, you tell me what I need to know. So I quite like that component of it.
So when you're talking to people on the doorstep, Kieren, do you find that they want to talk about technology and the relationship with people and technology? Is it something you introduce into the conversation, or
can we just clarify? But before you answer that, Kieren, can you just remind us of your real job? Now, I'm not suggesting that you're not going to win. I'm just saying that in your real job, before you were standing as an MP,
the one that pays money.
Just to summarise that a bit, so we get some context here.
Well, so I'm currently the executive director of I4, which looks at internet content policies. Most recently, we sort of produced an educational packet, really, for schools, for dealing for 11 to 14-year-olds about online content, which is actually a very serious problem, mostly focused on sort of sexual online content or online content that children are seeing, and teachers are very worried about. And how do you understand it? I see it as a kind of a green cross code, for online content, so that children have an idea of what this is and how to deal with it and how to think about it, because they're seeing it all the time. And this is everything from, literally from pornography through to things that are, affect body image, through to things that demonstrate, that sort of give you a weird sense of what relationships are, because kids live online. And the internet is not the real world. So that's our sort of the focus on that. That's one of my jobs. I have another job. I'm on the board of Nominate, that runs the .uk registry. That's a long story, but we're sort of helping Nominate to become a little bit more of focused on that registry and less focused on some of the tendency that had gone on.
And so, just to be clear, sorry, Kieren, just to be clear, the .uk registry, that means that they manage anything ending in .uk and .co.uk. That's right. That's like the domain. Yeah,
it's one of the biggest internet registries that there is. I mean, obviously .com is massive, far bigger than anything else. And I think that the UK comes, I don't know, fourth or fifth in terms of the world scale. I think there's just over 10 million, maybe, no, that's wrong. I think there's more than that. They'll be furious at me if I don't get it right. I'm going to guess there's roughly 12 million .uk domains. And .uk, I imagine anyone listens to this in the UK knows .uk or goes to a .uk brand. I mean, it's a pretty big, important registry. And we're just trying to, Nominate is trying to deal with a bit of a restructure and face the sort of the modern world that we're facing. This has changed a lot. And so Nominate sort of edging into figuring out how to deal with that going forward.
As well as your third and most important role, which is working with us and doing some consultancy with us.
Which I love.
Yeah.
Which I love doing that. I love the work we did on the IGF. That was fun. What's the other work that we did? We've done a whole batch of products. And I find that fun. I mean, I really like that we dig into some of these issues, quite important issues, and then find out how to talk about them in a way that other people understand, and also try and find those little patterns. I don't think there's enough research that's going into the DNS. There's a lot of technical, obviously all the tech guys are always over it, but in terms of like translating what's going on with the internet at that foundational level, and then to other people, policymakers and businesses and whatever, I think DNS, RF, and OXIL are the only people that I think are really doing a good job. So I love doing the work that we do. I think it's great.
And Emily's going to pick up on a bit of that with the NIS2 work that you've been doing around the European Commission directive. But yes, carry on, please. I'm interested in this thing about thinking about politics and the internet.
Yeah, I've got one question about your Lib Dem colleagues and generally your impression of politicians in general. How much do you think they are thinking about tech? Because we're not really hearing very much about tech policy in this election so far, are we?
No, and I'm really surprised by that. I think it's the type of, there's all kinds of problems that we have with our political system, but we're not getting in people that know about technology, and also there's a generational gap, I think, there. There are people who are sort of my age and younger. The internet and technology and phones is absolutely vital part of their lives, and they tend to have more knowledge about it. In terms of people understanding technology on a policy level in the same way that they dig into education or transport or health or finances, it doesn't exist really. And I find that a little bit worrying in the sense that technology and the internet are so crucial to our modern lives. And also because we've had some pretty important legislations gone through recently. So, one of the things I will be trying to do is get people to take this more seriously and talk more about it.
Do you think it's a generational thing? I remember the Senate being interviewing people about TikTok earlier this year, and one of them said they just sounded so old. They were asking questions that really were just like basically shocked at how the internet and social media work rather than the policy issues underneath. Or you had David Cameron saying, just suddenly announcing that he wants to end encryption for security purposes, and just showing a real disconnect and a real just not understanding the technology, or is it something else?
No, I mean, we've had this speed for a long time. I remember when back in 2005 when we had that World Summit, and there was the biggest job was everybody on the technical side was to try and educate the politicians and the decision makers about how the internet actually worked. If you remember, people were talking about the internet they just didn't understand how it worked at all fundamentally. And it was really worrying because they were coming up with plans that just literally did not make sense. And if you sort of came up with similar ideas on transport or health, everybody would think you were completely mad. Yeah. But because it was technology and the internet, no one really understood. And there was this sort of, because nobody really understood at that level, you could pretty much, they were saying lots of things that weren't true and agreeing with them. And it was a problem. And unfortunately, we still haven't got to the point where the sort of understanding of technology is a valued an important component in legislation in sort of parliaments and around the world. And we need to get there because it is really crucial to modern life.
Isn't it, Kieren? Because, you'd think politicians would naturally have an affinity for the internet as a huge communications medium, as a way of cutting down barriers between themselves and constituents and the public, and a way of understanding what people are, what people are talking about and concerned about. I mean, you mentioned the Online Safety Act, which is now law, and that's had a very difficult passage through Parliament. I mean, I remember going in and briefing officials back in 2018 about very early thoughts on that, about, when at that time it was all about electoral interference and the abuse of online social media platforms. And of course, your work with I4 about child protection and child safety, the sort of the sort of content that young people are exposed to now online. I mean, it's an enormous societal problem, and the engagement with fundamental rights is so acute. A lot of the commentators on the Online Safety Act really point out that it is quite an illiberal piece of legislation on one view, in that there's always a real hesitancy, particularly in the United States, of regulating speech and regulating content. It's one of these really difficult things to pin down, because we all know things are bad. We all know that young people are seeing things and interacting with things that they shouldn't be at an early age. But when you try to actually pin it down in legislation, it's incredibly difficult without getting overly prescriptive or perhaps censoring content. What are your views on it? And particularly in your candidacy as a Liberal Democrat, very kind of more at the free speech type of end of the spectrum, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, it is complicated, but then it's no more complicated than healthcare or finance, or this is what things are complicated in life. But the way that you come up with solutions is you really dig into things and you really understand them, and then you try things out, and you be open about it. And we haven't got there with technology and with the internet, and we need to start doing it rapidly. I mean, the Online Safety Act is to my mind, it's a good example of why Parliament and politicians in general really need to understand technology better. So effectively what they did was they tried to pass this law from a sort of almost philosophical perspective, which was making the UK the safest place to be online in the world. I can't remember that was their tagline. And then when they started actually trying to do it, they found actually that's incredibly complicated and difficult. It's a good slogan, but actually it's not as simple as just doing that. And that's what took so long, really, was people were going back and forth trying to find something pragmatic. What they ended up doing is they're not putting most of it into secondary legislation. So they said, we want to achieve these things, and then we're going to let Ofcom decide, Ofcom being the independent regulator. So they basically palmed it off onto Ofcom. And now it's down to effectively the culture and the people in Ofcom to try and navigate it themselves. So far, I think they've they've understood the task, and we'll see how they do with their rules. But really, fundamentally, this should not be a secondary legislation thing. The people that are representing the rest of the country should have a good grasp of this stuff, and there should be good debates in Parliament, and we should be creating laws that will at least start tackling the difficult parts. And there are ways to do it. Yeah. There are some proven ways that work. There are some ways that don't work. Some of them feel counterintuitive right now, but they won't in 5 years' time. They feel like, oh, of course, that's what we do. For crossing a road. Why, we paint white lines on the road and then we stick a yellow globe that flashes when people are near. I mean, if you just look at it, they're sort of mad on one level, but it's what we do, and everybody understands it, and it works. And we need to find what the internet equivalents to those things are.
Fantastic stuff. So moving from sort of, you mentioned national legislation, broadening it out to European legislation, I'd like to introduce the next topic, which is the impact of new European legislation. It's called NIS2, and I'm going to hand over to Kieren to ask Emily a few questions about that. But Emily, would you introduce NIS2, what that means and why it matters?
Yeah, so of course, being technology, there has to be an acronym. And sometimes when you spell out the acronym, you're not really any wiser. So it's the national, I don't even know what NIS2 stands for. Network Information Security Second Directive.
Well done. We're going to have a new feature where because we hate AI, we're going to introduce an AI explainer that we could ask things like that to. So it's sort of bot. AI or whatever. So that's going to be coming, which is robot. Please tell us what NIS2 stands for or means, and then we can argue with the robot as well. But anyway, Emily stood in for that for now.
So the first NIS directive, Network Information Security Directive, actually came in 2018. So it's very short time for the European system to revisit this act, and really identifies and really reflects how critical infrastructure is vitally important to protect from cyber attacks, and actually the level of network security is not where it should be. But in the middle of this updated directive is sort of flown in a bit like a spaceship, one article about the WHOIS database and domain names.
Can you just explain a bit about what is the WHOIS database in a sentence?
In a sentence, it allows you to look up technical information and registrant information about who owns a domain name. Shall I go to the NIS2 directive?
Yeah.
The Network Information Security Directive is the second attempt by the European Union to really get cybersecurity right. And it reflects the growing dependence of societies on technology, and that flows into critical infrastructure protection, and also there's providers of essential services. And actually the domain name system is an essential service because it really makes the internet work. And in the middle of this second directive, the NIS2, is a single article relating to WHOIS. Now, the WHOIS is a lookup. It's a way of finding out who's responsible for a website or a domain name that you come across. And it traditionally provided a lot more information than it does now. So, what are we doing? We have this.
What are you tracking?
Yeah, we are. Thank you for that question, Kieren. We have been. So this is a European directive, and that means that every single member state, 27 member states, have to transpose it into their national law. That means they have to make it law. And it's a huge piece of legislation, mainly relating to network security. And then there's a domain name bit sort of stuck in the middle. So we are, at the moment, we've launched a tracker the NIS2 transposition tracker for Article 28. That's the WHOIS article. And what we're trying to do is work out how each and every member state is dealing with those provisions, who's the responsible authority, whether they're consulting on the law, and whether they've actually finished the job. The deadline is October. At the moment, we're seeing a handful of countries that don't seem to have started yet. So the general impression is late. But there's also quite a lot of texture in the way that the different member states are dealing with it.
Kieren, do you have any questions for Emily about NIS2 and the tracker?
Yeah, lots of questions. So the first was, so how are people implementing it? I mean, how vague is this? Sometimes these directives are very precise, sometimes they're very vague. How vague is this particular one? And then how are people doing it the same sort of way? Are they doing it in different ways? Where are they sort of extending beyond were you surprised that they're putting it? And then are they scaling back? Are they pushing forward with this?
Yeah, it's so the thing about directives is that it's supposed to leave the member state with quite a lot of flexibility. It's like providing a baseline, and you've got to come up to that baseline. You might not need to do anything, in fact, in your national legislation to do it, or you might need to do a lot. But the WHOIS article in NIS2 it feels very precise, but actually the more you think about it and look at it, the more questions you have. And a big part of it is it's requiring providers of entities that provide domain name services to do some validation and identity checking on registrants. Now, if you've got a phone or a bank account, that's not really a controversial thing. You know, you expect to provide your identity when you have a key thing like a phone number.
What do you mean by provide your identity?
Well, so I think it's like, I downloaded an app for a scooter the other day, and I provided I stood there with my driver's license and then had a photo of me taken. And that's actually to just sort of drive a scooter around Oxford. To register a domain name, traditionally there hasn't been that level of checking at all. And it's something that the domain name industry have been really set against, I would say, because it obviously adds some cost. And also there's a kind of philosophical type of element. You know, the internet is not like telephony. This is the free open internet where everyone can do things. Privacy and anonymity are highly prized. But Kieren, your question was about, you know, what are the different approaches from member states? And the brief answer is there's quite a lot of differences. You know, some are not doing anything apparently. Some have kind of put some enabling legislation in place, and then they're going to shove the rest of it into guidelines or secondary legislation. Some are pretty much copy-pasting what's there in the directive, and others are really going for it in more detail. And there's you know, in technology, there's always more detail that you can add. So it's a mixed picture, mixed bag at the moment.
In terms of you know, the different views on this, I'm assuming people like law enforcement would love it if every single domain, you know, had to be locked down, you know, where they live and the picture of the person that registered that domain. And I'm assuming, in fact, I know that the domain name industry would much rather have what they would say is a very flexible, fast-moving registry and registrar setup. I don't know where businesses sit. I imagine businesses sit a little bit more like, I'd like to know if somebody's registered, you know, my brand name with an extra thing on. So is there a struggle going on internally with this? Does that explain why there's variations? I mean, how are people deciding what to do with this directive?
It's a surprising, but kind of not surprising, massive crucible, if you like, for tensions. The WHOIS issue has been going on. It's been a sort of combustible issue in the ICANN environment for like 20 years. And essentially it's about names and addresses of registrants. And as I say, in terms of bank accounts, in terms of telephones, this isn't really controversial. but it is hugely controversial potentially in terms of human rights, of cost to industry, and really the battle lines, if you like, and they really do feel like battle lines in the context of ICANN, are the registries and registrars of the domain name industry on one side, and sometimes with ad hoc alliances with the human rights communities, and business, law enforcement, and intellectual property on the other side.
Just playing devil's advocate for a moment, the WHOIS service, and I know this, is a public service that can be harvested by robots. So when I give my name and address and personal details to my bank, I don't see those details then being published on a public service. And that's not just a public service in my trusted country with MPs and potential MPs like Kieren sort of governing that. It's actually in every country in the world through a WHOIS service, and it's to marketing companies and all sorts. So I think, wouldn't you agree, Kieren, the sort of level of exposure of this data is much more than the data that you would be giving for know your customer verification to a bank or a scooter service in Oxford?
Yeah, I remember very early days of WHOIS, which I loved because I was a journalist and I would look up a domain name and it would give someone's mobile phone number.
Right.
And I would say you would simply just call them up. I spoke to all kinds of interesting people. I just called them up like that at home. How'd you get this number? They were completely baffled. It was terrific. But of course, that was wide open. Once everyone figured that out, which wasn't very long, it was wide open to abuse. And people started saying, you can't stick my mobile phone number on this readily available database. This is crazy. But by the way, I still want my domain. And so we've hit this kind of uncomfortable compromise.
It needed
I do think there might be a shift.
Yes,
with this one.
And there wasn't there? Because it went, as you say, Kieren, it went from way too open, and then and there were human rights issues relating to that. The European Commission wrote to ICANN on several occasions saying this is just nuts. Do something about it, and nothing was done. It was too open. And then overnight, with the advent of European data protection law, which had it protected Europeans' data no matter where in the world that was held, that essentially closed down a lot of that data that Kieren was so reliant on earlier. That just vanished overnight. So it went from too open to too closed.
So where are we now? At the DNS Research Federation, we've developed what we call a NIS2 tracker. If we swap to the slide at the moment, you can see on our website under dnsrf.org. If we can look at that, you visit dnsrf.org and you'll notice in our research section, so you click on research at the top there, and you end up on under internet governance section, there's a NIS2 tracker. And if you click on that, Emily, why don't you just summarize what this tracker is saying and what it's about?
So this is giving you a really a snappy overview of what's happening in each country. So you can see the member states there in the table and a very sort of immediate idea of where they're at. So the red button shows you that there's a consultation happening. Where it's not started, there's just not very much action.
So, sorry, what does not started mean? When does this have to be done? When do the countries have to have completed their NIS2 transition?
So they have to have transposed the directive international law into their member state law by October.
October,
it's June now. So if you haven't started...
Hold on, so excluding holiday, which in Europe I believe is about 3 months.
Yes.
You've got
Not much time.
Couple of weeks to get this done, and 8 countries haven't even started. 16 are in
I think this
preparation.
is really coming as a massive shock to a lot of American colleagues because, not to make generalizations, but a lot of people I speak to from the US kind of think of Europe as a country ruled by the European Commission, and they're like, well, there's a law now, and actually, well, when you're talking about a directive, it has to go into each and every member state. Each of them has their sort of sense of how things should be done. But back to the tracker, right? So if you...
I have a question, which is, so let's, I can't see which countries haven't done anything yet, but presumably if you are, let's say, I'm going to say Estonia, but it's probably wrong, and you're an official and you realize you have to do this, you're going to look at what the others have already done and decide and say, well, do that. Is there some kind of theme coming through, or are there clumps of different people, the way they've approached this?
I think that there are probably clumps. So Belgium, we're just looking at now, has gone quite a long way in its transposition journey. I think one of the problems with the whole NIS2 directive is it's mostly about network security, and so it goes to it goes to the national cybersecurity people to implement it. And then they've got this domain name stuff in the middle of it. And they're like, hey, what's this? And so sometimes they will sort of pass that off into guidelines or secondary legislation. But with Belgium, Kieren, you looked at Belgium, didn't you? And I think that they'd pretty much copy-pasted what was there in the directive for Article 28.
It's getting very, very technical here for me on the sidelines, but just looking at the tracker for Belgium, there are 4 phases, and we've now got the archive of those phases. So basically what happened, well, we don't call not started really a phase. So we're either in preparation, and we can say in the preparation phase, we can look back and look at Belgium. We can see that they had a consultation planned, when it started, when it ended, the consultation website that was available at the time for people to talk about it, and other useful links. Then they transposed, which meant that they transposed, now help me if I get this wrong, a European directive into a national law. So this is really, just to understand this, Europe has made this sort of directive and said, all of you countries, I want you to do something that reflects this directive. So all of these countries are going to reflect this in their own way. Where does that leave somebody who just wants to protect information on the internet, or for law enforcement who want more information on the internet? Are they going to have to come to a thing like this to try and figure out what the law is?
I think it's a great point, Lucien, because some of the aspects of this new directive are now becoming familiar in European law, which is it will have an impact outside of the geographical territory of the European Union. So it's expected to affect what we would call the generic domain name space, which is primarily operated from US companies and throughout the world. So it's not just European entities that will be covered here. So it has what we would call extraterritorial effect and turnover-based fines. So if you get it wrong, it's going to be very costly.
When you're talking about turnover-based fines, then that reminds me of another whole subject that we must discuss at some time, is the implementation of GDPR and ending up with all these horrible cookie notices all over the internet that seem to be setting more cookies than GDPR was trying to protect us from. Are we going to have NIS2 notices?
Well, it's really hard to know how it will work out, but one of the things I think I'm looking forward to as a lawyer is the impact of the extraterritorial effect even within the European Union, because we're seeing, like in the Czech Republic, they're proposing really high fines for breaking the law on whois. So say if you were sitting in a different jurisdiction, can you somehow make it that you could fall under that Czech law?
Wow.
When you wanted to take an action.
So we had Brexit, we stuck two fingers up at Europe. If we don't implement this in this way in the UK, you're saying the law still affects us anyway if we want to participate in the European internet. So we have to pay European fines if we don't agree with this, the elements of this new directive, or if we're visiting a Czech website or a Belgian website.
I think if you've perfectly compartmentalised your data and you know who are European residents and who aren't, then you're fine. But when you're processing when you're dealing with Europeans based in the EU, you've got to comply by European laws. So yes, absolutely. And this has been the sort of approach of the European legislators for several years. Is like, we are going to be the world's internet regulators.
Wow. Kieren, do you have a last... I mean, we could talk for hours on this subject. Do you have a last question for Emily on this subject?
Well, I was going to say the problem with this is that we'll probably end up putting this back on the user again. So GDPR, and I understand what they were trying to achieve, but I don't know about you, but I am so sick of going to a website and having to pretend to make choices and be clicking on things before I can actually look at the website. And that's just because of bad legislation and bad implementation.
Have you seen
We're
the
thinking
new
about
vendor?
This
the new vendor
I could easily
choice
see a
cookie.
scenario where I have to tell, every time I go to a website, I have to tell them where I'm living. So they can say, oh, and then in that case, we've got to apply this. So we could end up, multiple clicks before you get through into any website, just because we have a law that is not that good.
Yeah.
And it bothers me.
And just a very last thing, the privacy laws have had a massive impact on the data flows across the Atlantic for fighting cybercrime. And actually, the WHOIS debate is part and parcel of that wider problem of needing to protect fundamental rights and privacy, which democracies absolutely have to do, but also ensuring that the fight against cybercrime doesn't stop as a result. And that's the situation we're kind of in. It's, hardly anybody goes to jail for cybercrime. The international coordination and cooperation is way lower than it should be. And the flow of data across borders is very much part of that. And particularly US counterparts are incredibly cautious about doing anything that will engage GDPR.
Yeah, and you see that and there it is. You see, that actually explains it completely, because as a techie, I just want things to be smooth and seamless. I want to go and visit a website. I don't want to read legal statements and agree to things before I go, because I like to visit 10 websites. But at the DNS Research Federation, we are interested in cybercrime, the anatomy of cybercrime, and how that works. And if NIS2 is trying to address those problems, hallelujah, I'm all for that. But there has to be a way of getting out of the clunky legal and towards the smooth and open. And that introduces us to our next topic, which is a new product that we launched on Times Radio last week, which is called Trustchecker. I say it's a product, it's actually a service for consumers. And let's just talk a little bit about it. I'm going to show a few slides here just because it saves time. But essentially, if I go to Trustchecker itself, one of you give me a domain name.
Google.com.
Google.com. Okay, let's look at that. Let's just put that into Trustchecker, and we can see that it's got several factors that are interesting. You'll notice it's got C for caution. It's had reports in the last 365 days of hosting malware, of providing sources for phishing attacks. Just to remind people, phishing is when consumers are sent a text message or a link, and they go to a third-party website that purports to be something that they are familiar with, like a famous brand, and they are lured into providing their PII, personal identifiable information, or even their credit card information via a fake website. So we're phishing for their information. spam. Google is very good at managing spam, so I wouldn't expect it to have had a history of spam reports. And obviously the domain name is more than 1 year old, and newness of domain name is actually a threat factor in internet security when you're looking at domain names. But I'll put it to you, Kieren, why do you think that Google's getting a C rating? Sorry, I will
interrupt. It's an absolutely vast site, isn't it? I mean, it's absolutely vast. I mean, I use elements of Google. In fact, I've probably got 5 or 6 tabs open right now using google.com. And I also upload. I use Google Docs. I use Google Sheets. We use Google Maps. So I can, that's Google. So I imagine with the billions of people using Google, someone's got to be up to no good on it. I would imagine that's why something vast like google.com has got a C rating. Is that right?
Good guess. I mean, and just to say, we're not making any judgments about Google here. I'm going to explain a bit about that, why this is getting a C rating, but also to explain the rating. Sorry, I landed you there, Kieren. Basically, the Trustchecker gives things. We're just trying to keep it simple for consumers. It's an A, B, or C rating. And A means that we haven't found any records. So we're the messenger here. We're not making any value judgments about these sites and services. We're just saying we've got the DNS Research Federation. We've got bordering on 100 feeds coming in. This is sort of intelligence threat signals coming into Trustchecker, into the DNS Research Federation in our platform called DAP.live, which is the DNS Analytics Platform Live. We've got all of these feeds coming in, and we're looking for patterns and appearances in some of the threat feeds. And we found some that contained google.com. So what's actually happening here? What we're looking at is, in that collection of feeds, we're looking at the presence of famous brands in those threat signals. And as you would expect, you just saw it there with google.com getting a C rating. The technology, media and telecom sector is actually got the most threat feeds. This is simply because they are hosting a load of websites that can be created very quickly, very dynamically. Somebody spots a problem with them, they see that it's a phishing website or something like that, and they get it taken down, but it means that they have appeared on those feeds. So in a way, you would expect the technology, media and telecom sector to have the most reports in the last 365 days, and we think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in what we call sharing threat signals to reduce the time that they appear on those feeds, and also to give them a different rating in Trustchecker, which means that they're onto it. So a difference between threats that have been reported and threats that have been dealt with, what we call threats mitigated, I think is a very important measure that we would like to introduce whilst working with those technology companies. Number 2 is home delivery, and I just want to take you both through a couple of interesting things in the home delivery section. DHL. You get these awful messages from DHL that are basically saying that, you've ordered something from Italy. I ordered some olive oil from Italy. I suddenly get this message that says that I've got to pay a bill. So I'm angry anyway. I'm worried about this delivery anyway, and I'm vulnerable to an attack. If part of that link contains 77dhl.com, I'm going onto a phishing website. I'm not even actually in DHL. What we've said is that this has a very a new phishing report. It hasn't been corroborated by many other lists, and the domain name is less than 1 year old. So that's a problem. Again, another site. Sorry, I keep switching to the other browser. MyEvery.com. I don't know if any of you order anything from Next, or there's lots of Marks and Spencer's use Every. If you visit the myeverysite.com, you're going to get a C rating, because that is a bad site. Every.uk.vip. This is a phishing site that's and this is an interesting point. This is a phishing message that I received and my mother-in-law received a few weeks ago, We know it's a bad site. We know it's a phishing site, but the feeds haven't picked up on that. And that makes a very important point.
Thank you. Yeah.
To be clear, neither of those domains are actually run by Every, right?
No.
None of them. In fact, every.com, I haven't got it here. Every.com is also a B rating itself because it's had its own platform compromised in the past. So, this is confusing for the consumer. So what do? They come to Trustchecker, they type it in, they get what I know to be a scammy site, but the feed providers haven't reported it yet, and they get an A rating. So what we do is we ask them a question. We just say, this is an A rating. Why did you check this link today? And they can just tell us what's happened, and then we can give them some further advice. But also, we're using this as feedback to the feed providers themselves and saying, you haven't got this reported yet, but actually consumers are telling us that this is bad. And then we also ask them a few questions about, who do you think should be dealing with this? Should it be the big tech? Should it be Every? Should it be the police? And finally, at the end, another quick question. Do you agree with the rating that we've given? And that's where we will find out whether they agree with an A, B or C rating or not. I'll just flip through a couple more interesting things. Public sector.
Is the idea then that you feed this back into the industry, and so then we take this and figure out ways to make it work better?
Oh, thank you for that question. A big passion project of mine is what's called the feedback loop, because all of the threat sensors are pushing this threat intelligence out. They're pushing this threat intelligence out, but they're not actually evaluating that. I mean, I've heard some threat signal providers, one was a domain name registrar, saying to us, we're sending this intel out. We don't know if it's any good or not. And what's missing is that two-way conversation with the industry. And we're at the DNS Research Federation, and as database engineers, we're trying to introduce a new concept called a feedback loop. So we want to push it out, and it's a bit like an eBay rating for feeds. It's sort of saying, it's a feed of the feeds. Is that feed, is that sensitive information helping you or not? Did it work?
And it sort of brings us back to our previous conversation about NIS2, because actually you would think it would be the simplest thing in the world for the entire ecosystem to kind of get together and say, actually, that threat wasn't a threat, that threat has been mitigated. If you're in our sector, watch out because this is coming for you. And yet, a lot of the actors in that ecosystem are really nervous about sharing that level of intelligence because they're worried about whether they're going to be hit by privacy laws, whether they're going to end up being liable for the information that they have given. So it's one of those situations where you feel like it just ought to be better. How should it be better? And why isn't it easy to do?
Yeah, well, because it's not easy.
It's not easy to do the technology. But it isn't nearly as easy as it should be to just share those threat signals.
I think the problem now is so manifold. Cybercrime is going up. It's not going down.
Yeah.
The biggest platforms with all the data that they have is not enough. If some bad actor is operating over one border and operating in your domain, you need to know. You need to share those threat signals. And I think the big platforms and everybody just have to get over their fear and try and solve these problems in another way. Just looking at just back to Trustchecker, just looking at way down there, out of the 13 sectors we've been looking at, the public sector, Kieren, close to your heart right now, is number 10. Just want to show you a couple of public sector things. I keep doing this. HMRC account.top. Now, another thing, I think that the domain name obviously plays a big part in luring a consumer into a threatening environment. You get messages from HMRC, you're full of fear, you're full of anger, you're guilty about your tax, and I say that you're vulnerable to being scammed. there we are with a threatening. I know this one, this HMRC account.top is registered in China, and now it leads to a junk site. But more seriously is the post office. I don't know how you both feel about this. I just feel uncomfortable at the following. The post office, and we're looking at our DAP.live analytics platform, of all the public sector threats reported in the last 365 days that we were able to track, the post office is at the top of that. Now, what does that mean? At the moment, the post office is under a spotlight because it mismanaged IT. It would, to spare the blushes of, and I say this with, it makes me feel sad to say this, to spare the blushes of a few software developers, they sent people to jail. To spare the blushes of a few managers, they sent people to jail. They could not believe that the Horizon software could have any bugs, and it's just so embarrassing. Please, just let's send thousands of people to jail rather than admit that we got a few bugs. So it's abhorrent to me that happened. But they've moved on, they've apologized, they're attending select committees, and they're working on rebuilding that brand. Now, what we're looking at is their brand being employed in messages to lure consumers into fake post office websites and services and losing money. So we're seeing consumers, and they're the top there. I'm just interested in your thoughts about that.
Yeah, it feels counterintuitive, doesn't it? Because you would think that people would be aware of the post office. But actually, my thinking is, if you think from the mindset of a scammer, and these are, and scammers spend a lot of time thinking this through. Some of these are very sophisticated. What we actually know about the post office right now is that there were a lot of people sent to jail and fined, and that the people that caused all of that are currently not in jail. They may be getting some hard questions and select committees, etc., but they're not in jail and they're not being fined. So from the perspective of the average person, what they do know is that the post office is willing to take it really far and get that money out of you and send you to jail. And so maybe, I don't know how they're wording these messages or how they're approaching it, but there is a fear factor around the post office right now. And I imagine, I'm not a scammer, but I imagine a scammer's going to think about that and say, if I get this into someone's inbox with a mild threat or need for you to do something, then you're probably going to maximize the amount of money that you get out of it. That's my theory. But it'd be good to have, people that are experts in this digging into it. I mean, there are obviously police people who do this all day, every day. I'd love to hear their thoughts about how this works.
Yeah, so one of the things that strikes me looking down that list is, it's quite UK orientated. We've got the BBC in there, the NHS, but actually post office itself is used internationally to describe that function. So it's a much more international term. That's one thing I would say. But another thing, and I've got really very little except just 2 incidents there to show it, is like the post office. What I feel with the Horizon scandal, apart from the sort of the revulsion at what happened and the terrible human tragedy that happened, is that this is not an organisation that's really in control of its IT. And another thing that happened this week, I don't know if you saw it, is that Santander was hit by a major cyber attack. And looking at our data on the incidences of Santander type of names in phishing attacks, which we did for Which, the UK Consumer Association, is that they are the top of the list. And it's probably far too much of a leap to say, based on 2 data items, can we build a whole theory? But theories have been built on less. And also, I'm not blaming victims of cybercrime for what happens to them. But maybe there's something there. Maybe because the brand enforcement, the getting onto the phishing attacks and protecting consumers from believing that they're interacting with you when they're actually interacting with a criminal, is part and parcel of your cyber hygiene, I would say. because it's less about selfishly protecting your brand. It is much more about protecting the public safety.
I think that would be a fantastic topic for a future podcast, is the role that brands can take to protect the consumer generally versus the role that brands take for their own brand protection. I think we're at the end.
I wonder as well whether it's a little bit like, you know, the phrase all publicity is good publicity. I wonder whether for scammers, you know, any sort of awareness of any brand is good, even if it's extremely negative. Like Post Office is extremely negative right now. Santander is extremely negative because they've got, you know, sort of vulnerabilities. I wonder whether a scammer's like, great, everybody knows the name Santander right now, let's go.
Yeah,
there might be a strange scamming rule.
That, you know, if something's in the news, you start to see domain names pop out. Lucian, you were telling me about Euro. You know, we're just about to have a major football tournament in Europe. There's all sorts of Euro type of names popping up. Taylor Swift's on tour in the UK at the moment. All sorts of tickety type of scams going. So, you know, definitely the scammers have got their eye on the news.
There's so much more to say about this. This is, I think we've got to the end of this podcast today. This has been fascinating for me. We have a lot to learn. We gave ourselves half an hour and we've taken nearly an hour, and we want to make it a little bit tighter. It's been fascinating, but I do want to mark this in history because this is our first podcast, and I think this is going to be a great and really popular podcast. We're planning to launch, we are going to publish this. We might edit it a bit, but we're going to end up doing a live stream from September, and we're thinking of getting famous people on as well and talking about their experience of the internet, so watch this space. We're going to work on the nightclub, try and get Emily and I out of the nightclub, and I think Kieren is perfect. Work a bit on the sound. But it's been a very interesting discussion today, and I think there really is a gap out there in this sort of discussing the internet from this sort of legal engineering and more public journalistic point of view, and I think that's a really good mix. Today we've talked about politics and tech, and the role of politics in tech and their knowledge of tech, of the internet. Emily's been sort of talking about this new directive that's come from the European Commission, NIS2, which is really quite technical, but I think it's going to impact us all. And I've introduced a new service for the consumer, for the public, to check the safety of domain names or links in emails and messages that they don't trust, and to check the trustworthiness of that at Trustchecker, and that's available at trustchecker.co.uk. So voila, that's it. That's the end of our first podcast. I want to thank Emily, who's here today, and Kieren, who's remotely, and for giving us your precious time, Kieren, in these. Rishi Sunak just landed you, didn't he? And that's it. You know, you've got a few weeks now where you've had to cancel everything, but you've fitted
cancel everything for basically 6 weeks.
Yeah, next madness. Time I want to talk about the political party's use of TikTok next time.
Oh,
yes. Yeah. And what my teenage daughter thinks of it.
So we'll see you next week. I've just got back from holiday, but the idea is that we will roll this wherever and whenever. See you then. Thanks very much.